Thank you very much, Lisa, for those very kind words. I'm delighted and honoured to be here today. I would like to thank Lisa, who invited me to speak, all her other colleagues who've helped to put this on today, Queer Cymru, and indeed the Senedd for housing us, and the Heritage Lottery Fund for funding the event. I think it's a great thing that this is happening, and it's particularly significant, I think, that the Senedd has been nominated as the top LGBT employer in the whole of the country. This is something I could never have even contemplated in the years I'm going to talk about. When I was growing up in the Rhondda in the 1940s, this city was like a foreign country to me, born in the Rhondda. People used to talk about it as a foreign country, speaking a different language. And I don't mean neither Welsh nor English, but some in-between accent. It had airs and graces, as we saw it at the time, which completely distanced itself from us in the valleys. And coming here from the valleys on day trips, on a slightly creaky train line, nothing's changed, or trying to navigate the winding roads before the A470 in its current form was built, was like an invitation to a different world. I used to enjoy coming here and having lunch in the old Cardoma Cafe in Queen Street. It seemed like the height of sophistication to me at the time. A visit to the arcade bookshop opened up new intellectual vistas to me, and reading the graffiti on the walls of the public lavatories in Cardiff opened up undreamt of possibilities, which at the time I was unable to enjoy. Now, the existence of different and incommensurate and apparently contradictory communities is in part what I want to talk about today. In particular, what it felt like for me to grow up as a queer boy in the Rhondda in the 1940s, 1950s and early 60s. And slowly, very slowly, becoming aware of the possibilities of other worlds, other ways of being, and ultimately, hopefully, finding a breakthrough which brought them together. Now, I was born in 1945 in Porth, at the end of Porth in Llwynkelen, overlooking Trehavod. And the Rhondda I grew up in had been made by code. Its ethos and values shaped by the solidarities and divisions wrought by the industry, the landscape shaped by its demands. The playing field opposite the house I was born in Porth, was built on an old tip. You could still scrabble illegally in the 1950s for small coal at the top of the hill going down to Trehavod. The brightly painted terraced houses that now feature in guidebooks to Wales as an example of the new Wales were then, of course, all pretty grimy with coal dust, were still gaslit way into the late 50s, and were uniformly covered in grime. All the doors a dreary NCB green, unlike the different colours on each house today. And the slag heaps still dominated the valleys, like in my imagination I used to see as a black Switzerland. Now, both my parents came from long-term mining families, but they were determined that me and my brothers should not follow the family tradition. Both Mum and Dad had been part of the exodus of young people from the valleys in the 1930s. My mother to do domestic work in Slough, my father moved with his family briefly to Bristol to find new opportunities. Dad's family soon returned to Tonopandi, homesick for the Rhondda. My mother had also come home soon after war broke out to be with her mother, and was then conscripted into the munitions factory in Bridgend. My dad was called up and served on a minesweeper for the rest of the war. Now, they married by special license in 1944, just weeks before D-Day. My father had special leave. He was just 20, not quite 20, my mother was 22. Thereafter, they remained at the same house at the edge of Porth for the rest of their lives. A house where my maternal grandfather and grandmother, my father and mother lived and died, and where I and my first brother were born and brought up. When my mother died in 2014, at the age of 93, she'd lived in that house for over 90 years. Now, that longevity itself tells a story, which I could go into at greater length and will one day. And that stability marks a critical element in my own life story. I grew up deeply rooted in a particular social world and way of life. Although there were frequent rows and we often lived at the top of our voices, it was loving and caring if crowded home. Although I grew up as a sulky and grisly child, hypersensitive and acutely shy, I could see now, and sort of took for granted then, with the ruthlessness of the young, that I was deeply loved, even doted on by my mother, my aunt, and my grandmother, who lived with us. My relations with my father, who everyone said I was so like, were more fraught and tense, with constant rows. But I never doubted he was proud of me and wanted me to succeed. And I eventually recognized, too late perhaps, his own vulnerabilities, an acutely sensitive man trapped in an overwhelmingly macho culture. But there was a problem that soon became obvious to everyone, especially, I fear, my father, though it was never fully discussed, never hinted at directly, but it was to shape the rest of my life. In a world where boys were boys and girls were girls, by the standards of the time, I was not quite either. I was bookish, not sporty. I preferred playing with girls rather than with boys, and dolls rather than guns. I used my Meccano set to construct simple little households and palaces rather than trains or pieces of machinery. I was horribly bullied and cried easily. I was slight, ginger-haired, couldn't roll my R's, couldn't whistle to save my life, and had a lisp. I was a classic sissy boy. When my class broke into separate teams for football or cricket, the team captains used to toss not to have me in their teams. Apart from the teasing and bullying, which was painful enough, I didn't come to any real physical harm. I survived. And certainly till my mid-teens, I had no sense that my increasing social and gender differences were related to being sexually different. Yet being simply a queer child in the broader sense was difficult enough, and the source of constant shame, guilt, and misery. Of course, I know now that many thousands of little Jeffreys, as well as Jennifers, were going through similar experiences in hundreds and thousands of towns and villages at the same time, and ever since. But at the time, I felt completely isolated and had the strong sense of being an outsider, of not fully belonging, and this shaped me indelibly. The Rhondda I grew up in was a byword for community, for neighbourliness, for warmth and mutual support. And that was indeed the truth. But the downside was that it had built for itself a conservative, defensive culture. It bred intense local trust, but also a distrust of a wider world. This was a community of intense family life, overlapping with a strong sense of neighbourhood, so that family and locality often merged. But whatever the blood, and local differences, This sense of a strong community was focused around a notion of the family, and a division of labour within the family which seemed like a law of nature. Men were the breadwinners, women looked after the home and offspring. The origins of these patterns lay in the dependence on work in the mines, seen overwhelmingly as a man's job, and the lack of work outside the home for women. Being able to maintain your family properly was a matter of intense male pride. Failure to do so was deeply shaming, in effect a demanning. In 1935, a famous Rhondda MP, W.H. Mainwaring, called Mainwaring by the citizens of the Rhondda who voted for him, called Mannering by his family, his daughter, who I met much later. That says something. But he put the position in the 30s with stark clarity in the context of protests against unemployment and the hated means test. They wanted security for their homes and sustenance for their wives, he said. If they were not prepared to strike a blow for these things, then they were not fit to be called men. These attitudes persisted. My father hated my mother doing the part-time shop and later catering work she did do, and he hated even more when she became the main breadwinner when he had a breakdown. There was, as there continued to be for many years, a rigid segregation in many aspects of life. The pub and club were men's domains. Even in the 1960s, it was seen as a bit shocking to see a woman in a pub on her own. My mother would not have dreamt of going into one. Neither come to that would I, until much later. And women were excluded from working men's clubs except on special occasions, when their husbands could sign them in. But home was different. Presiding over it was the mythical figure of the Welsh mam, stern defender of their daughter's chastity and their son's needs, self-sacrificial pivot of the household, the tidy wife who held the family together through thick and thin. I grew up with two mam figures, my nan, and then assuming the position in growing magnificently into maturity, my mother herself. Now, these segregated patterns were common throughout the mining communities of Britain. My partner Mark lived in a very similar coal mining community in the northeast of England with very similar life experiences. These were complex societies where the relations between men and women, though highly gendered, were often based on intense love, intense mutual dependence. But there were also intense disputes, and fiery battles often occurred around the division of labour. Couples who married in the 1940s, like my parents, were more open to the alternative visions opened up by the cinema, the radio, and from the early 50s by television, and gradually greater freedom of travel in the dawning age of affluence. And by the 1940s, the old religious certainties that solidified local standards, especially female chastity and shame if the standards were breached, were beginning to crumble. The valleys were opening up and older values were weakening. By the 1950s, chapels were closing in every village in the Rhondda. Yet the core values and mores remained socially conservative, and it was difficult, especially, to think outside the heterosexual world. Homosexuality existed, as I eventually found out, but never as a distinctive way of life. And I only began to learn about the covert networks that existed as I was about to leave for university. Same-sex activity was subtly crafted into the heterosexual dynamic. Leo Apsey became famous as the Labour MP who introduced homosexual law reform into the House of Commons in 1967, was the holder of a South Wales seat. And he saw in the gender order of South Wales one of the likely causes of endemic homosexuality in the valleys. The dominance of mam in the family, he once told me, in his rather crude Freudian manner, produced a large number of homosexuals in the valleys, mammy's boys. As he wrote elsewhere, excessive attachment to the mother can be evoked and encouraged by too much tenderness on the part of the mother herself, and can be significantly reinforced by the small part played by the father during the boy's childhood. I'll just pause there to say it's really interesting that someone who's often been presented as an icon of the first campaign to change the law in the late 60s, in fact had deeply reactionary views, in my view, on homosexuality. Alas, I had no sense that there were many other Mammy's boys when I was growing up in the Rhondda, and I had no identification at all with potential suspects. The obvious candidates for suspect homosexuality conform to a pattern common in highly gender-segregated societies of effeminate men and butch women. The effeminate man would in all likelihood be called a proper boper and tolerated as a harmless freak, as long as he respected the gender order. Two women living together down the street might be acceptable as close friends with a wink or two. But for boys like me, engaging very feebly with the bracing atmosphere of school and sport, a mocked effeminacy remained the only fate, though tomboyish behaviour amongst girls was more warmly tolerated. Homosexuality, where it was lived at all, survived in the secret byways. What above all I lacked, without really knowing it at the time, were stories of others like me, who I could recognise myself in, identify with, and feel a sense of belonging through. One of the semi-conscious purposes in becoming a historian of gay identity and gay life from the 1970s was to find and tell our common stories. In this way, I learned much more about same-sex attraction in South Wales long after I left there than when I was growing up here. I met Fred, born in 1894, who lived in Barry with his daughter in the early 1970s at a CHE meeting in Cardiff. He had fallen in love and had sex with another man during the First World War. He was consumed with guilt about it and suppressed his feelings for other men for the next 50 years. And it was by chance that on the verge of 80, he learnt about CHE, and for the first time in his life became part of a company of other gay men. I interviewed him for my book, Between the Acts, and kept in touch. When he died, I was deeply touched that he left me a small bequest. Trevor Thomas was more flamboyant and became an icon of the gay liberation movement in the 1970s. Born in the Valleys in 1907, he had a successful career as a museum curator until caught up in a cottaging case and his career was destroyed. He too got married, and it was only 20 years later that he felt able again to explore the new gay world, opening up from the early 1970s. For a while, he was a constant presence at CHE events. Much later, I came across the story of Rhys Davies, the Rhondda-born short story writer and novelist. Born in 1901 in Cardiff in the Rhondda, he was of lower middle class rather than mining stock. He was a shopkeeper's son, and that inevitably distanced him from the local community. But it's clear now that his developing homosexuality pushed him into a lifelong exile, mainly in London. He published his first novel in 1927 and was later befriended by D.H. and Frida Lawrence. His work had echoes of Lawrence's preoccupations with a puritanically repressed sexuality and the contradictory pressures of a narrow nonconformity and cloying warmth undoubtedly constricted his sense of growing difference. He had to leave to be. Yet, like many in exile, he never fully escaped the Rhondda, writing about it through his career. He never explicitly writes about homosexuality, and you need to be a subtle reader of the codes to see any references to it in his autobiography. But it suffuses his writings as it did his life. He died in 1978. Just as much younger people from the Rhondda, like myself, were beginning to feel freer to talk about our gayness. He lived in his later years near Russell Square in Bloomsbury in London, near where I had been a student, and I like to feel we may have crossed paths, strangers in the night. But he died unheralded by the new gay movement, by then highly active all around him. For Rhys Davies, as for the vast majority of his generation, reticence remained the necessary condition of his sexuality. Now, recent writers have pointed out that South Wales was not especially homophobic during this period by comparison with some other areas, including London. A fascination with cross-dressing, for instance, had a long resonance in the Rhondda, and I have strong memories of my uncle regularly in drag at local carnivals. There are even suggestions that prosecutions for homosexual offences were rare in the Glamorgan constabulary area during this period. And as I've suggested, there were many forms of accommodation. A sort of live and let live attitude, as long as you did not bring shame on the family. But that was the great taboo. When I came out to my father in the early 1970s, he said he would accept my gayness because he loved me, but he wanted me not to do anything at home that would embarrass the family. For years after, though I had by then become internationally well known as a gay writer and historian, I still found myself bound by that promise and kept my gay life quite separate from my family. In the usual way, they sort of knew but never had to confront it, and I found it difficult to confront them. The bonds of love had become bonds of duty and discretion, and I was indeed 60 before I felt I could bring together everyone in my family, my partner's family and my friends for my 60th birthday party. From my mid-teens, however, I had a growing sense that my difference was very much about sexual difference. I could scarcely give it a name, though others tried. I remember being asked as I got onto a school bus, I must have been about 14, if I was a fairy. I'd never heard the word in this context, but I guessed what it must mean and muttered something, but I felt marked forever. The irony of this was that years later, I met the guy who had asked me the question in London, and of course he turned out to be gay as well. Words can be weapons, but they also help to give meaning to inchoate feelings, and I gradually learned through words that my desires had a name, many names, which said something about me, what I was and could be. I picked up hints about what that could be from snatches in newspapers, report of court cases in the Rhondda Leader and Porth Gazette, oblique pieces in the columns of agony aunts in my mother's women's weeklies, even accounts of inversion and homosexuality in decrepit medical texts I found in the books of my long-dead grandfather. Much of this, in any case, was still in my mind. I never experienced any sexual advances from adults. Perhaps I was too naive to notice them. Perhaps I was too unsporty, too poor a joiner to have regular extracurriculars to come into any danger. But I did eventually have brief and mainly unsatisfactory encounters with school friends. And for several years I had sexual fumblings with my friend Derek, who lived up the street. We regularly met on Friday evenings when his parents went to the club. They were not very fulfilling encounters. Derek refused to kiss or undress, but they inflamed my imagination. When I later went to university, I came across James Baldwin's Another Country and thought it wonderful and life-changing. I copied out a few paragraphs in a letter to Derek, hoping he would think them equally inspiring. A couple of days later, I got his reply. As I opened the envelope, the charred remains of my letter fell out. Next time I went home, I saw Derek as usual, and we went for a drive, as if nothing had happened. As we stopped on a remote mountain patch, he grabbed me, and the usual non-kissing sex followed. I was still desperate for physical contact, however unsatisfactory. So apparently was he. He later got married, had children, and I lost touch. But his was probably a more typical queer life at the time than mine was to become. By my late teens, I knew I had to leave to become whatever I could be. Luckily, education proved a route out. Despite or perhaps because of my growing sexual misery, I was determined to succeed. My school, Porth County, was famous at the time as a machine for getting people out of the valley. Porth County was the school attended by Rhys Davies, who was to become my hero, by Gwyn Thomas, the novelist, and numerous others. But it was a highly selective system, which meant often breaking the ties that bonded you to your family and friends, risking losing the virtues of community for another world. As my English teacher, who wrote an article on it, wrote, "It was a bitter irony that economic necessity should have forced a socialist community to such an elitist system, but it was inevitable. Survival had a higher priority than equality. But it wasn't just economic necessity that drove me away. Survival for me meant finding ways of exploring my deepest desires." Now, in many ways, I never fully left the Rhondda. Many of my growing preoccupations as a queer boy in the valleys, about who or what I was, about belonging, about finding a valid way in the world, became translated in my later intellectual and writing concerns about identities, community, social activism, personal liberation, and collective involvement. And the personal ties to the valleys remain strong. Indeed, they still do. I still visit regularly. My brothers and their families still live here. And it's only a few years since my mother died in the Rhondda. Very much by then a matriarch who kept us all together. But the train that took me from Drehafod Station to Paddington via Cardiff in late September 1964 did more than transmit me to university and new career possibilities. It opened the way to my becoming gay and to all the joys and pleasures, pains and delight that involved. It was indeed finding another country, but that's another story for another day. Thank you.